Welcome to part 2 of using physical literacy to create quality movement experiences. Well, this second part is really taking what we know from research and trying to give it to you for practice purposes as a pedagogue or a designer of spaces, and also to take what I've seen around the world that has been great practice, and I haven't yet researched, but maybe give you some insights to things I've seen done really, really well. So I'm going to start with the notion of confidence by design, not by chance. And sadly, when I go around the world talking to people, I ask people, is confidence important? And they all answer, yes, it is. It's critical. But then I ask, what's the lesson plan, or what's the things that you're doing to specifically make confidence build and hopefully not erode? And sadly, most of the times I get a blank stare, that they don't have particular intentional planning. And I think we can talk a little bit about that as we go forward and help you become better at your craft of confidence by design.
I'll reiterate for you this slide that shows there are 4 domains of competencies that we look at: psychological, creative, social, and physical, and that we must have intentional coupling between the confidence side and each of the domains. So that means that you have to think about, when you're providing quality movement opportunities for children, how do you have children realize their confidence in social negotiation, confidence in self-regulation, confidence in problem solving, confidence in avoiding collisions? These are all examples of each one of the domains, and there are ways to have the lesson plan or your words or their realizations during the practice sessions, during the lesson plans, during the coaching sessions, where the child realizes the confidence in each one of the domains. Of course, not every single lesson plan has to deal with each 4, but I try to think about each lesson plan having at least one of those domains where I'm intentionally coupling confidence to competence. We like to call this the benefits of confidence slide, and this reminds us about why we have to intentionally couple confidence with competence. So you could take 2 people, say, 2 people having exactly the same competence, say to skate ski on a flat surface, and one of them has higher confidence, and that person will be able to perform better, perform longer, realize better performance gains than the other person. And so we like to say that confidence is the mediator of competence to create performance. Say that once again, you can get performance by having both competence and confidence together. So this slide also illustrates that a person who has a certain amount of competence, and you'd expect their performance to be good, that if they exhibit low confidence, we typically see lower performance levels. So let's look at the benefit side of this graph. People that are competent and confident have a reduced risk of injury, have faster and a full return after injury. They tend to demonstrate enhanced performance compared to those who don't have confidence, but at the same confidence level. And then they also have continued participation. They'll stay in the game longer. And those who have low confidence, we see minimally self-doubt, uncertainty, perhaps apprehension, and worst case, fear. But this is critical to realize that we can see both benefits and negatives of confidence coupling to competence. And we certainly don't want the erosive behaviors, we want the building behaviors. One of the things that we really try to do when we are working with a group of children for an extended period of time, or even adults for that matter, we like to think of confidence sources. And the overarching theme underneath this is creating a confidence culture. And when you create a confidence culture, you can't just think about confidence coming from within. You have to think about all the factors around the person that can also influence impact their confidence, impacting both positively or negatively. So what we call this diagram is the confidence sources diagram. So if you think about a student in school, whatever age they are, there are many people around them, proximal to them, close to them in time or space, that can influence their confidence. Indeed, there are also people when they leave school that can also influence their confidence, so you can think about the distal sources as well. But today I'm going to really talk about the local sources. And you can imagine a student would be perhaps influenced by a classmate or classmates, by therapists at the school, by parents that are attending the school, by the various teachers they're exposed to. Even the equipment that they use can change their confidence as well, both building it and eroding it, as well as any coaches or leisure pedagogues. So every person that you see typically has a constellation of people around them that can influence or impact their confidence. We found through research that it's interesting that about 20% of the students will think that they're really important in building or eroding their own confidence, and they'll say, these other people around me aren't that important. But 80% of students or athletes or performing artists will tell us that the people around them are equally as important as they are in confidence building. And that's why we talk about building a confidence culture. So it's critical to help children, classmates, and others to learn how to interact through body language, through words, through lesson plans in establishing confidence for people, because they have such an important role. Here I have a word slide that we asked a bunch of athletes about what are things that build confidence and what are things that erode confidence. And you can see they're separated on one side and the other. And you can classically see here that words matter, that the words that people associate with confidence erosion are things like mistake, negative feedback without the presence of positive feedback, overly criticizing a person, not being heard, not feeling as part of the process. And you'll see the word mistake in there, and they often don't use the word failure, because most people see failure as part of success as long as it's allowed for. And they try to avoid mistakes, which is the view of the adult in the room. So we really think about a negative phraseology. It doesn't mean you can't do what we call a reinforcement sandwich, where we say, hey, here's a negative thing and here's a positive thing. We're not saying don't do that. We're saying think about what you say. Words do matter. Look at the other side. What do people associate with positive? It's praise. It's appropriate feedback. It's, that I have a group that I feel belonging to, that I'm being heard. These are the things that are critical. And so you want to create a confidence culture where we hopefully tilt in favor the positive phraseologies against the negative ones. This is a slide that we like to provide people to illustrate examples of confidence building and confidence eroding language or lesson plan setup. If you look at the one on the top where we have a coach, and if they say, if you try harder, you might actually become good one day. Well, that would be an erosive way to say something. Whereas the other side says, hey, one of these two progressions is going to help you with that technique that you've been working on. And in the second one, it's important because a lot of coaches will try to steal confidence from people, where they say, because of me, I am the result of your success, as opposed to attributing to the student that their success comes from their hard work. And so that's a stealing confidence language. But if you look at each one of these, I want you to stop on this slide and reflect about language that could be used by friends, by equipment managers, etc. And think in your real circumstance how it might materialize. If you look at the bottom one, practice design, I've seen this so often, the horseshoe drill in hockey, or having one agility ladder for 20 kids. And you see a big lineup of kids and just one little bit of activity. And for 10 minutes, a person might get 4 repetitions. That's a confidence eroding approach. And you might say, hey, I only have one ladder. Well, I'd argue, don't use it. If you take the ladder and separate it into 4 short ladders, 5 people can be executing on each ladder. Or you might separate a lesson plan into 4 component parts so that there's everybody moving at once. We know from our science that practice design is confidence building because it gives repetitions with knowledge of results. So it is important for you to reflect on each one of these confidence sources and what can be building and what can be eroding.
Another topic I want to talk to you about that's really important in physical literacy and thinking about it as creating quality movement experiences for all. This is the notion of human sustainability. Many of you may have heard about the Sustainable Development Goals for the world. And many countries, if not all, have adopted this notion that we need economic viability and environmental sustainability. And what people have done recently in Sweden is developed the inner development goal concept. And what this said was, in order to get environmental and economic sustainability, we need to have people have certain characteristics about them so that we can achieve this economic and environmental sustainability. It's kind of like the third leg of a stool. It becomes balanced. So we in physical literacy call that thinking that people have to become sustainable, human sustainability. The other phrase we use for this is durability by design, where we talk about creating people that are durable, both psychologically, physically, socially, and even creatively. That means it can last a long time. So I'm going to talk very briefly about how quality movement experiences can foster human sustainability. So one of the things we think about when we're thinking about human sustainability is inner development goals. And please do visit the website and learn more about it. It is a really great concept. But what I want to talk about today is human sustainability achieved through movement experiences. So we've already talked about on the left-hand side of this diagram that if you construct positive challenges correctly by the environment that you build or the programs you deliver, you can activate the physical literacy engine in a positive way. You can create a quality movement experience, which will result in most people getting a positive movement experience. Now, what I'd like you to do, and this is a really important exercise to try, is that if I do a physical literacy enriched activity, we'll talk about it in a second, but if you do that, I'm going to say to you that if you sat down somebody with somebody else that was doing the activity with them, and you went through this list, the 5 topic strands of inner development goals, being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting, you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of words beneath there that, like courage, creativity, communication skills, appreciation, connectedness, critical thinking, etc. All of these terms can come from quality movement experiences, all of them. We've tested this on hundreds and hundreds of people, and people, after doing a physical literacy enriched activity, will identify almost all of these as arising from the activity. However, if I use a pure fitness approach, and even a quality fitness approach, where I say, hey, we're going to run 5 laps, do 20 push-ups, 20 sit-ups, and 5 front squats, when you do that, and you ask people to sit down afterwards in a general class, and you ask them about that experience, they'll identify maybe only 3 or 4 items out of the 20 or so here. So this becomes interesting. It means that you could actually take physical literacy and apply it to games. You could take physical literacy, apply it to physical activities, physical activity applied to drills, physical activity applied to exercises. And if you physical literacy enrich them, you'll get most of the inner development goals checked off. Whereas if you use a pure physical activity mindset or fitness mindset and think about sweaty mess or the number of minutes people are sweating for as the outcome, you don't get many of these. So what I'm encouraging you to do is think about physical literacy enrichment for all the activities that you do. So you not only get the goal that you're looking for, which could be a fitness goal, yay, or an activity goal, 60 minutes or 16,000 steps, but you also get these as well. This becomes very interesting when you're trying to sell movement at schools as a valuable thing, because schools value the Convention of the Rights of the Child, Article 29, which identifies that schools must provide the best for kids mentally, physically, creatively, spiritually. And if you can also say that quality movement experiences designed by physical literacy can create this list of wonderful personal attributes, that something is worth selling.
I want to talk briefly about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and there's a great 2-page summary of it. Sweden put it into act January 1st, 2020 during the pandemic. It's important for people in movement in schools to understand the convention, and there's a 2-page summary on the link there that you can find in the PowerPoint. So here are the 3 articles of the Convention of the Rights of the Child that I particularly focus on when I'm working with movement in schools. The one on the left is called the Article 29, the education goals. So that's the statement about schools and what they should be doing for children. And just read the first line. The development of a child's personality, talents, mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential. That's what schools are supposed to do. So movement is part of that because it's physical. And you can read the rest of it there, which is all very important, like connections to nature and the like. The other article that's important is the voice of the child. If you're going to do something for a child, you better listen to them. You better talk to them. You don't just hope you're doing the right thing. Figure out if it is the right thing. Talk to them. The other article is Article 31, which is leisure. Some people call it the right to play. It's not that. It's actually the right to leisure. And just read the first, I'll read out. The right of a child to rest. So if they choose not to move, that's their choice. Otherwise, you're violating the convention. And leisure. To engage and play in recreational activities appropriate to their child's level of ability and appropriate to their culture. Not just sport, but cultural life, including the arts. So it is really important to have a balance between cultural, artistic, recreational, and leisure activity. And we in movement have the opportunity to do all of that because it covers all of it. But just think more broadly about movement than simple fitness activities or a single sport. It's much bigger than that, and you want to address the Convention of the Rights of the Child. Some of you will have seen this paper that I'm going to talk about, which I have a link to here. And in Canada, we have a phrase, nothing for us without us. If you're going to do something for children, talk to children. If you're going to do something for people that are older, talk to older people. If you're going to do something for people who have different physical abilities, talk to people with different physical abilities. Nothing for us without us. But what we did was we listened to the voice of the child in this paper, and we talked to 7,800 students, age 6 to 13. Very important age developmentally. And we asked them about movement in school, movement with family, movement with friends. And I'm going to show you a graph about that, and I want you to really think about what I'm about to say because it gives us power in movement at schools. So what you see here is a more complicated graph. I apologize. But what you see is ages 6 to 13 with the dots in each one of the rectangles here. And you have reading and writing at the top, in school, with family, with friends. If it's in the green and higher, the child says it's really important. I value that. If it's towards the coral color, it's not valued. The next one is math. How important is math in school? How important is math with family? How important is math with friends? Not whether they can do math, but is it important to you? The last one is movement. We don't ask them physical literacy. We say, how important is movement to you from 6 to 13 years of age? Is it important in school? Yeah, it is. Is it important with family? Yeah, it is. Look at this one. Is it important with friends? Vitally important. So what you can see here is on the bottom line, when you ask children how important is movement in their life, from 6 to 13 years of age, it gets more important, and it is more important with friends than reading and writing and math. This is really critical because I can hear, can't you, 7,800 kids screaming, help me move, give me movement. This is great evidence that children value movement, and we need to do everything in their power so children can find their movement voice and execute on the value that they put in movement.
The next topic I want to talk to you about in practice is the concept of inclusion. Many times when we come in to work with children, we have an idea in mind of a certain level of ability or a certain normal or able-bodied child. And this often creates circumstances where kids that don't fit in because they have different abilities, sensory abilities, or different physical abilities, aren't planned for. And this results in their exclusion, or worse yet, it creates pull-out programming. Oh, we're getting together to do this, but you're not welcome here. That's called pull-out programming. Even though they might be around for every other activity, and even if they do stay, they're often spectators rather than participants. So in physical literacy demands that you make considerations for inclusion so that everybody can belong through movement. And you're not just conforming to be an able-bodied person. It's what does it look like for me to move in this context? That takes a lot of work and a lot of resources, I got to tell you, but it's worth the worth it to actually be inclusive by design. So when we talk about inclusion, we're really talking about people of different abilities. And so there are people that have different sensory abilities, and there's a whole range going to diagnoses, like things like people that have autism have different sensory abilities, but there's also people that don't have that diagnosis, but also have a range of sensory abilities, a hypersensitive person, etc. But there's also different abilities physically, and certain diseases that can have impacts on your ability to move, but there's a whole range. When you think about the range of abilities, you don't think about diagnosis, you don't think about disease, you think about everybody's got an ability, a wonder that they're born with. And how can I work with you to develop that wonderful attribute, as opposed to, you must be like this. And so different abilities and inclusion is a really important concept, whether that's different cognitive abilities, emotional abilities, physical abilities. Sex and gender is another inclusive pathway. We're going to talk later on about gender bias, which is your perception of sex and gender, which almost nobody talks about, but it's critical to talk about, and different cultures. Different cultures have different ways of moving. We all share movement, but we have different ways of moving and thinking about movement. And even just different activities that are associated with different cultures. So understanding, having a world view about different movement patterns in different cultures is really important, as opposed to a conformity view, which says you will do the activities that we do in this region. Well, what are your activities that you do? If you're a newcomer to Sweden or a newcomer to Canada, what do you do? I'm really interested. Let's talk about that. Let's see, can you share? And we'll share with you. So it's not about making them conform to the Swedish or Canadian way. It's becoming you and accepting you in this environment and accepting that culture. One of our success stories in research was illustrated in this paper. And if you wanted to read it, you can. And it's called Everybody is Welcome Under the Big Top, a study on circus arts instruction in phys ed. Now, it's not really talking about using phys ed as the only way to be inclusive. It talks about, why is circus inclusive? And so if you read it from that perspective, that means you could make your sport more inclusive, your recreational activity more inclusive. So this paper realized that inclusive movement experiences are possible using an approach that is very different than adapting physical education or adapted coaching techniques. Adapted, the word adapted would mean, hey, we're able-bodied here. I'm going to adapt so you can fit in with us able-bodied people. Now, that's not a bad idea, don't get me wrong, but inclusive practices takes a slightly different approach than adapting, which is a bit of an ableist mindset. So I want you to think about, how do you create it so that everybody can have a movement experience that's based on their own ability? And that's a little tougher than it appears, but here's an example. This is a paper that illustrated that if you use design principles of quality movement experiences based on physical literacy, you can achieve inclusion. And this paper in particular, different levels of ability, different interests, and different sexes and genders. So that's a great success story to be hopeful for. I share with you another paper that's been accepted, and it's called Sensational Schools. And this is physical literacy enriched opportunities for students with neurodiversity. So children that are neurally diverse have different abilities to emotionally regulate, different abilities to perceive things. And so they might be hypersensitive to sound, etc. So what this study did was it used physical literacy and took a bunch of movement pedagogues, which were early childhood educators, physical education teachers, physical therapists, put them all together and taught them about physical literacy, and then use the physical literacy practices to create inclusive spaces for children that have neurodiversity. And it was so good that it was almost impossible, after a year of doing this, it was almost impossible to detect the children who had the condition in the group of people participating. Not only did it benefit that child, but all the other children had greater empathy to this person's circumstance They weren't just a spectator anymore, they were a participant and they were a peer. So I encourage you to really think about what do inclusive practices do. Look at your own lesson plans, look at your own movement sessions and say, are you being inclusive to all abilities, all ages, all sexes, all cultures? Another element that I want you to think about is the notion of resilience. And resilience is really the ability of a person to overcome adversity, a challenge in their life. And so that's why we like to use the word construction of positive challenges. And that just simply means that you create environments where a person is challenged enough. There might be some slight negative emotions coming into that challenge, not too many. And then their circumstances set up for them that they can overcome that challenge so they then get positive emotions at the end. Therefore, a net positive movement experience. But when you design things through constructing positive challenges, and the person can see themselves as being responsible for overcoming that adversity, that challenge that you presented for them, science begins to show us that doing that in classrooms and in movement settings helps them in other situations in their life, in other situations where they're facing adversity. And just remember, movement experiences are social, and therefore they help you to socially negotiate with each other and overcome social challenges through using movement experiences. This was the first paper to illustrate that physical literacy is a great predictor of resilience in kids. And we're talking about resilience in kids, talking about dealing with bullying, dealing with shaming. So real life resilience. And what this study did was show that physical activity was not such a great predictor. Fitness was not a great predictor, but physical literacy was an excellent predictor of resilience in children. And that just supports everything that I'm telling you, that if you use a physical literacy approach, you can help build resilience that isn't just in the movement setting, but in their daily lives. And this is a really important aspect to helping create and build children, frankly, that can handle the challenges of the future. This paper here is written by Phil Jeffries, and he's is in Ireland, and he is part of the Multi-Systemic Resilience Research Group, the international research team that really studies resilience. And he took it upon himself, because he was so excited about physical literacy, to write this paper called Physical Literacy and Resilience, the Role of Positive Challenges. And I love this paper because it really is a good one to read. I've got a link on here that you can go and grab it for. And it really talks about how do you create positive challenge for people in movement settings. And from a resilience point of view, I strongly encourage you to read through this to help you consolidate, well, how do I do that in the classroom? I mean, if I was there in presence with you, I could show an exercise or a drill that could actually meet these goals. But this paper is a good one to really say, how do you create movement practices that create resilient children? So that whole section on inclusion and resilience leads me to a really important concept that you can start applying in your delivery of movement opportunities for children. And that's creating agents. I kind of like it because it's like secret agents. But what you can think about agency as is the ability of a child, when you're not present, to organize their own behavior. Pretty important. Or if they're a group of kids without an adult, can they organize their own behavior? Which means a social skill, physical skills, psychological skills, and creative skills. So when we create agency in children, we are giving them the ability to work independent of us, which is a vital skill set in this day and age. And just to support that, here's some research that was one of the first bits of research to support agency created through physical literacy. There's a paper written by Dr. Natalie Hauser where she studied kids prior to the pandemic and then during it. And what she found out, in Canada anyway, 85% of children during the pandemic reduced their physical activity levels because the structured physical activity was gone because parents, teachers suppressed by closing things down. And so the number of children that didn't meet the physical activity guideline of 60 minutes a day doubled. That's a bad result. But what was really interesting from a physical literacy point of view is the third line that says, we asked children, do you believe in movement? And the children told us that their value of movement in their heads as a result of what we did during the pandemic as adults dropped. So not only did their physical activity drop, it changed their minds about the importance of movement to them. That's not good. However, the good news in this story was that 15% of kids did not drop their physical activity. And when we looked at their physical literacy, it was the kids that didn't reduce their physical activity were the ones that were physically literate, which means that they were the ones that were agents of their own future. And that was true for their parents as well. So physical literacy can be productive to people. If you make people able to organize their own behavior by making them physically literate so that they can have a lot of competencies in movement and land, air, ice, snow, water, different groups of people, different environments, and also have the creative skill set to problem solve for themselves, well, then you create agents. And this is something that we want to have achieved through quality movement experiences. One of the most important topics that I study nowadays is the notion of gender bias. And this is an interesting one because in this day and age in Sweden, Canada, we talk a lot about sex as assigned at birth, your physiological, biological characteristics as a male or a female. We also talk appropriately about gender identity and all the diversities of identities that we wish to accept and should accept. But one element of this, the sex and gender equation that's not talked about a lot, is the notion of gender bias. Now, what this means, since we do have males and females and different gender identities, which are generally associated with feminine and masculine thinking, people, males or females, masculine or feminine people, will have perceptions, beliefs of how one gender should act versus another. I'll say that simpler. Our expectations as a person are influenced by our gender bias, whether it's explicit, meaning you know about it and are doing it purposely, or it's implicit, you don't really know about it. So nonetheless, I can tell you that many gender biases, the perception of the person and therefore how they deliver movement, can result in some not good things for people that are labeled as feminine or female. We know through hundreds of studies that this is a problem and it results in oppression. And oppression is an undesirable mistreatment that we'd like to fix. And we can. This is the good news story. Physical literacy enriched pedagogy can fix the gender bias. So this is a wonderful chart that I'll explain because it's a little sciencey. And there's a bunch of scientific studies on the left-hand side. And there's some scientific studies of children that were 0 to 5 years of age, some studies from 6 to 18, and one study on there for 18-year-olds and above. We've got more, but I just wanted to pick a few studies for you. And what I want you to see is that if you can see the vertical line in the center around 0, what these studies show, all of them, is that when they measured the competence and movement of females versus males, sex assigned at birth, from 6 months of age to, in our oldest study, 70 years of age, there was always a consistent finding that females, people assigned as feminine in your mind, had lower competence than males. Now, some people will say, hey, that's a sex difference. That's a biological difference. That's a difference due to genetics. Well, in actual fact, what we believe in physical literacy, and there's good studies to show, which I'm going to show you in a second, is that most of these differences from 6 months of age to 70, where there's a difference in movement competence, is arising from gender bias, meaning teachers, parents, coaches are acting in such a way that their expectations for females is lower than their expectations for males, resulting in this lower competence. Now, this is really important. If you actually think about this, there are a couple of studies where they asked parents, male and female parents, do you treat your kids equally? And they all answered, yes, we do. And what's interesting about this is that when we studied them, the kids' behavior with the parents in a playground, the actual parents had different expectations for their males and females, higher expectations for males, lower for females, despite them saying we treated them equally. This then results in the tragedy that you see here, because when you have a competence gap, you then get a confidence gap, which means that competence and confidence has been eroded. Then pride in yourself, belief in yourself erodes as well. Then you get lots of negative movement experiences, and then females in most societies associate unhappiness with movement.
So here's an example of physical literacy enriched pedagogy. So it happens to be using Circus again, but it's not Circus. Circus just happens to be a really good example of physical literacy enriched pedagogy. This paper compared standard practices in classrooms for movement, phys ed, against physical literacy enriched ones using Circus. And the difference was that at the end of the term, there were no differences between males and females in competence and confidence. Whereas in the standard phys ed, the differences grew in competence and confidence in a bad way. So I'm showing you this because we need to control our gender biases as movement instructors, and we need to really think, how do we create equal opportunities for participation and control the implicit, meaning we don't know about it, and explicit biases towards lower expectations for females. It's possible. Here's yet another study done in Saskatchewan, the province next door to me in Canada, and it used, once again, physical literacy enriched phys ed, but it has applications to coaching in sport, leisure pedagogy, anything. And PLIT PE was the intervention, which you can read in this paper, and it actually demonstrated that the psychological domain, affective and cognitive, and as well as the physical domains for the students that were in the physical literacy enriched program, their psychology and their physicality improved. This is great news. And it resulted in equal improvements in both males and females in the intervention group. So this is a second study, not using Circus, that used physical literacy enriched pedagogy by constructing positive challenges for everybody, resulting in an elimination of the gender bias. Very exciting. I want to share this graph with you because we often don't talk about this, and the future of physical literacy is going to depend on it. So there is a term called health literacy and physical literacy as well, just like there is numeracy for mathematical literacy and literacy and statistical literacy and the like. What I want to do here is I've illustrated something that most people haven't thought about before, but I want you to start thinking about. So if you look at this graph, what you can see is that I've made a big circle of health literacy in blue, and I've made physical literacy a green circle, and I've made it inside of health literacy. Now, initially people think they're very separate concepts, but in actual fact, they're not. Physical literacy, because we move as human beings, is just a component part of health literacy. But you need physical literacy as part of health literacy, and you can see this arrow on the top, it's both green and blue. You need both of those to actively participate in this world and get the physical activity that you need and thrive. And if you do physical activity, we know you get health and well-being. So this downward arrow is a no-brainer. If you become physically active and move a lot, you get health and well-being. But in order to become an active participant in society through movement, you need both physical literacy and health literacy. And interestingly enough, you need health literacy on its own to get health and well-being, because in order to eat right and sleep right, health literacy includes all the other things that aren't physical, that are important for health and well-being. So it's physical literacy and health literacy that are needed to be equated together to create health and well-being for all. So I'm going to summarize a bit now. I've shown this slide in my last part A, part 1, and we talked about movement opportunities at school. And I really want to force you to think about movement opportunities in the community that surrounds the school. We can no longer leave them separate. Kids, once they leave school, go to those movement opportunities. Once they graduate from school, they use those movement opportunities. Schools are part of the community and need to be thought of that way. If you're going into a school and a community that you're not aware of, you should become very familiar with the community opportunities for movement. Are there movement opportunities for all? Not everybody wants to run around the town centrum. Are there movement opportunities for all? And if not, that's an important thing to recognize and also try to fix. So we've talked about movement opportunities at school. If you do a good job in all of these categories, you'll have a physical literacy enriched school. There's none in the world at this moment. I've got some that I've been to that are maybe 50% on this list. Communities, even less. But we really need to use physical literacy as a mindset to say, how do we create schools as part of communities where everybody can belong through movement, where everybody can find their movement voice, develop it, and use it. I'll remind you, because I'm closing up this talk right now, here's the physical literacy engine. And I've talked you through it previously, but I use this diagram, this picture. I want every child across all movement experiences in school and community to develop a healthy risk perspective, physically and psychosocially. I want people to actively participate in their community, whether that's activities of daily living, intervocation, recreation, performing arts, sport. It doesn't matter. I want to evoke the ability to have a movement voice that can participate in this world. This engine that I show you here can be activated and deactivated. And for you, I look at this when I'm doing my lesson plans and I think about each pathway. I can't do all of it at once, but I can do most of it, and I can think about it as I design my lessons so that there's a level of challenge to all levels of ability. And that's inclusion. So this engine is something not to be trifled with. It can be a guide for creating great movement opportunities for children that create positive movement experiences. This is the open access paper that you can read. The link's there. You can type in the title and find it, which describes that physical literacy engine that I just talked about. It's got a picture of it in there. And it shows you the success of using this thinking when applied to physical education. But it'll work in sport, it'll work in performance arts, it'll work in recreational settings and leisure pedagogy. So have a read of this paper, because what it does for you is it supports the notion of physical literacy as a mindset that can help you design quality movement experiences for all. This is the wrap-up slide. When you put all the puzzle pieces together, using physical literacy as a means by which to design lesson plans to create quality movement experiences for all, you can think about this in different ways. The list I provided you. I want every child to find their movement voice, and preferably many movement voices. So there is ways to think about, what does physical literacy enriched movement pedagogy look like? We've talked about that a little bit already. It looks quite different than many of the things we've been doing in the past. Physical literacy enriched movement pedagogy would include physical literacy enriched exercise, physical literacy enriched games, physical literacy enriched movement drills, and any physical enriched activity. But physical literacy enrichment can also include injury prevention programs. It can include the gymnasium environment, the playground design. You've got some wonderful playground designers that use physical literacy as a concept in Sweden. It can change policies. You can have school policies based on physical literacy. You can have physical literacy enriched schools by having all the movement opportunities addressed. And you can take physical literacy and, in a dream world, create the physical literacy enriched community where all people can be attracted to that community to come to, but they can be attracted to stay, because that community becomes not just a house, but a home, a place where I belong. When you're working in movement in schools, it's so easy to think about guidelines that governments tell us about, that kids should be sweating 60 minutes a day. And that's a physical activity mindset. And of course, I want that to be achieved. But the world looks differently when you look at the world through a physical literacy lens. It doesn't tell kids, hey, meet the guideline, otherwise you'll get disease. The engine finds the reasons to move are intrinsic: connections, agency, competence, confidence, enjoyment. Those are the reasons why people move. So I've got 2 more slides here that you can look at on your own. One is the Canadian 24-hour guidelines, the Canadian standard for physical activity for kids. If you read that just one page that'll be there, it is very difficult to try to plan a movement opportunity. It is very difficult to plan a week for a child looking at that document. And in fact, we've had these documents for 30 years and they haven't made behavior change. Are they good knowledge to know? 100%. Do they change a child's behavior? Almost never. That's where physical literacy comes in. Here is a physical activity set of imageries. Physical activity thinking would produce guidelines like this, and we should have them in the world, and there's nothing wrong with them. These are the Canadian ones that talk about sweating 60 minutes a day, taking a few hours of stepping, walking around a lot every day, sleeping 8 to 10 hours a day as a child, and sitting less when you don't have to sit. And they're good concepts, there's no doubt about that, but they've never changed behavior of children. We do want children to be as active as possible and eat correctly, as the inset image shows, but this is a physical activity mindset. So the secret sauce of physical literacy is that it possibly is the precursor, the thing that leads into being physically active. And I'll leave you with this slide. This is a slide of a walk around Mondal, around the lakes there, about a couple of years ago. And, I had my Garmin watch on right here. And, I recorded, I walked 12.6 kilometers, burnt a lot of calories, did 26,000 steps, and 152 minutes of sweaty mess. But that isn't at all why I did that walk. I did it for physical literacy reasons. I wanted to reconnect with my friends from around Gothenburg. I wanted to connect with nature. I wanted to maintain my footwork. And importantly, I just got off the plane for 24 hours. So I wanted to fight off travel fatigue so I could be fresh and talk to the people. The bottom is why I do things, not the top. Some people will do things to meet guidelines, and that's okay. But most people do it for other reasons, and most people continue to do it for their physical literacy reasons.